Richard, given the reality, which some deny, but I will now accept, that there is a fundamental difference between mental states and physical expressions in the brain, how then do we make those mental states? Is there a way that physical matter of itself, in whatever degree of complexity, can generate through some emergent property the mental states that you talk about?
Well, it's possible. That is to say, it's possible that there is some law or other which says that when matter reaches a certain degree of complexity of interaction, it produces primitive sensations, and when it reaches an even greater degree of complexity, then it produces intentions and so on. It is logically possible that there is such a law. If there is, it will have to be incorporated into our scientific picture, and it would lead to an enormous revolution, compared with which quantum theory would be a small beer. This would bring into the, as it were, the constitution of science, elements like pink sensation, loud noise, wanting to have dinner, thinking that it's time to go home. All these would be basic constituents which science would, as it were, incorporate. If science were to take account of all this and try and provide a scientific explanation of it, it would have to introduce into science laws in which the elements were not just matter energy with certain kinds of attractive and repulsive powers, but things like sensations of pink, loud noises, desires to have dinner, thoughts that today is Saturday, and so on. These wouldn't be reducible to anything else. These would be basic data, and it would have to explain why a particular set of neurons, for example, produce the thought that today is Saturday rather than the thought that today is Friday. Science would have to explain why a certain arrangement of neurons and firings of neurons caused me to believe that the universe was 13.5 billion years old, whereas a slightly different arrangement of neurons would cause me to believe that it was 12.5 billion years old. That is the task. And since these are things that happen, that I have these thoughts, that I have these beliefs, science would fail unless it explained just that. What science has done so far, and I don't wish to denigrate its achievements, but so far everything that science has achieved has been achieved by, as it were, siphoning off the mental. That's to say, science aimed for 1800 to explain why things were hot. And it explained why things were hot in terms of a substance called calorie, which, as it were, if there was more of it in a stuff, then the stuff was hotter. But then people said, well, hotness is not really in the thing, it's in the effect of the thing on you. So, and what causes you to feel hot when you touch it is that, for example, molecules are moving very fast in it. So you've, as it were, siphoned off the hotness of things by saying, well, that's just a mental phenomenon, but the real thing is the physical thing, what's causing the hotness. And if you siphon off the mental, then you can have just a nice theory of the physical world, and that's simple. But if you siphon off the mental, it's there all the same, and you need to explain it. And ancient science sort of tried, of course unsuccessfully, but it tried to explain why things were hot or yellow or loud or anything like that. Then came along the 17th century and so on and said, well, that's not really in things, it's an effect of things on us. So we have a nice simple theory. And that's why science has been very successful, because it's siphoned off the things it can't deal with. But the things are there all the same, and if it wants a real theory, it's got to bring them back. And I must say that I think the prospects are very poor, because there's just so much richness about the mental life.
Well, it could be that there are some general theories that combine together. Like color, we see an infinite variety, millions of different colors, but they're based on wavelengths that are fairly small in their variation, and you can explain all the different colors by different wavelengths. Now, that's not explaining our feeling of it. I understand that, but in the same analogy, the argument goes that ultimately that will be done. So here's the question. If it's not going to be done by physical expressions of neurons, then how can it be done?
Yes, indeed. But let me just re-emphasize this point. What is characteristic of physical sciences is they're dealing with properties that they can measure.
Yes.
And they can do that because they're public properties, and therefore there can be a standard that you could take from one object to another, a ruler that you could take from one object to another, and you can say this is twice as long as that. But when you're dealing with the mental, to which one person has privileged access, there is no public ruler. And therefore there is no way of measuring that one pain is twice as painful as another, or one color is twice as red as another, or anything like that. These things undoubtedly happen, but they're not measurable. And the sort of concepts that we deal with when we have thoughts and beliefs, they're not reducible to each other. Just consider, forget the sensations for the minute, just consider the thoughts and beliefs that we have. Now, we may be able to express these in terms of a language, but this language would be fairly idiosyncratic to ourselves, since we all use words in a bit different ways from each other. But there could be, as it were, a grammar and a dictionary of my language, and therefore you could analyze my thoughts and my beliefs in terms of that. Consider a dictionary. Most of the words in the dictionary can't be defined by other words in the dictionary. The dictionary can give you examples, but relatively few words are simply matters of definition in other terms. We understand the words because we understand what they apply to, and we've got a general concept from what they apply to. We know what yellow is because we've seen yellow things, but we don't understand yellow because of a dictionary definition of it. So we have innumerable concepts which we use in our beliefs which are not reducible to other concepts. And the way we put them together into sentences, there are innumerable different ways we can put them into sentences to express different views. So if there were to be a science of the mental, it would have to deal with all our concepts as separate concepts. It couldn't regard one as twice as big as another, and so on. So laws of the mental would have to be as rich as the grammar and dictionary of a language. That is to say, there would have to be as many separate laws for describing my beliefs and thoughts as there are laws of the grammar of the language, and as there are separate terms in the dictionary. And since this would have to be slightly different for each person, and since each person's sensations as well are rather different from each other, you couldn't have those general laws which are characteristic of science. You'd have to have 1 million laws for each person, and that's a grave underestimate. And if you had 1 million laws for me and 1 million laws for you, and they were a bit different from each other and so on, you couldn't find out about them with much certainty, because the way we can find out about the laws of science with very considerable certainty is just because you quantify the concepts that are in them. And therefore, the law of gravity, there isn't a separate law of gravity for something that weighs 1 pound, a different law of gravity for something that weighs 2 pounds, and a different law of gravity that weighs 3 pounds. If there was, if the law of gravity varied with the mass of each individual it was concerned with, you could never have enough evidence in support of it, because there are very few objects which weigh exactly 3 pounds. So you wouldn't have enough evidence for how 3-pound objects behave. Now, it's like that with us. If there were laws, they would have to be so many laws that there was virtually no repetition. That is to say, very seldom does anybody have exactly the same conscious state as anybody else. And if they do, they certainly don't have the same brain state connected with it. Never does any person have a brain state identical to any other person. So there might be certain connections between brain states and so on, so that there are certain overall tendencies. Brains of this sort produce that sort of thought and so on. But precise laws enabling predictions simply wouldn't be possible, because in order to justify your claim that something was such a precise law, you'd have to test it many times, and to test it in the same circumstances. But there aren't going to be any same circumstances, so you wouldn't have enough evidence to establish such a theory. So for that reason, I don't think there is going to be a mind-brain theory.